And so Paul placed his hand. So now you've got Jews in the church, Samaritans added, Gentiles added, and now in Acts chapter 19, you've got some old John the Baptist disciples get added. And when they get added, they receive the Holy Spirit, they speak in tongues, in languages that they can understand. So that Acts 2 is the paradigm for the whole rest of the book of Acts. In other words, all these people are doing the same thing. If it were different, then Luke would have to say, well, they did the tongues, but it wasn't really the same tongues as we did. No, they were all the same thing. And in Acts 2, it lists the languages, and so they received it just as we have kind of idea. So the book of Acts, then, is foreign languages that are speaking and things. And then people say, well, what about the book of Corinthians? Because Corinthians seems to be describing a different type of tongues here. And this is from 1 Corinthians chapter 14. And so it's describing this. Now, what's the Citzen Leoben? The Citzen Leoben, a lot of times theologians, whenever they want to say something, they say it in German and it kind of adds weight to it and stuff, but it's gravitas, but Citzen Leoben means situation in life. Situation in life. They called it the Citzen Leoben. Some of you guys, Citzen Leoben actually, but some of you that have had Old Testament courses may realize that many of the Psalms, the different genres of Psalms, come from different Citzen Leoben. And so in the book of Psalms, you have each kind of genre of Psalm coming from a different situation in life. What was the situation in life at Corinth like? What was Corinth like at this time? Well, we'll talk about this when we go over the book of Corinthians and things, but Corinth was a sailor city. Basically, you had sailors from all over the world, and they didn't want to sail around the Peloponnese. So you had this kind of hand-like thing of the Peloponnese, and there was this, basically you could come in here and basically go across a 7-mile isthmus and then sail out the other way, and that meant you didn't have to sail like a couple hundred miles all the way around the Peloponnese in Lower Greece. You could cut off that 200-mile thing by just going over 7 miles of land. Today they've got a canal that goes through there called the Corinthian Canal. They just built a canal through there, but it's rock. It was really hard to do and things. But in those days, they actually just pulled the boats up, if they were small boats, and just dragged them over this road thing over and dropped them in on the other side, and then they go off to Turkey. So any of your stuff coming from Rome would come around, go into the Corinthian Gulf of Corinth, and then be transported. The bigger boats, they'd actually have slaves and stuff and would transport the goods from one boat on one side to the other side, 7 miles transporting, but it would save them sailing then all the way, very dangerous sailing too around that Peloponnese, and they'd be able to cut that off. And so it was a good way to save time. But as a result then, Corinth was a sailor city. It was actually populated by a lot of Romans, soldiers as well. And so you had people from all over the world, okay? People from all over the world there. And so here's what Paul says. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 2. Paul says, "For anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to men, but to God." So from this, people gather that the tongues of 1 Corinthians 14 was a different type of tongue. That is, it was a prayer language. Okay, whereas in the book of Acts, the people actually understood what was being said because they heard them speak in their own language. And so Acts 2, Acts 8, Acts 10, and Acts 19, those 4 passages, Acts 2, 8, 10, and 19, all refer to languages that the people understood. But in 1 Corinthians 14, he seems to be addressing something differently. For anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to men, but to God. Indeed, no one understands him. He utters mysteries with his spirit. But everyone who prophesies, and now there's a contrast. Paul says, a guy speaks in tongues, nobody understands what he's saying. Okay? He utters mysteries with his spirit. Nobody can understand him. But if everyone who prophesies speaks to men for their strengthening, encouragement, and comfort. He who speaks in a tongue edifies himself. But he who prophesies is just another word for preaching. Okay? He who preaches or he who prophesies edifies the church. So Paul's making a distinction here between a person who prays in a tongue and nobody understands him, versus a person who preaches that actually benefits the whole church because the church can understand what the guy is saying. Okay? Now, are these the same tongues that are in the book of Acts? And what I'm wanting to suggest to you is that the tongues in Acts in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 is a little different. Let me read chapter 14, verse 14. It says, "For if I pray in a tongue," this is Paul again, "if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful. So what shall I do? I will pray with my spirit, but I will also pray with my mind." And then Paul in chapter 14, verse 19, 1 Corinthians 14, 19 says, "I thank God that I speak in tongues more than all of you. But in the church, I would rather say 5 intelligible words to instruct others than 10,000 words in a tongue." Okay, so Paul says, okay, you want to do the tongues thing, I can speak in tongues more than y'all, but nobody's going to understand what I'm saying. I'd rather say 5 words that are intelligible than speak 10,000 words that nobody understands what I'm saying. I want to build up the church is the point, not just edify myself. So, what I'm suggesting here, and then let me just go down, okay, we talked about prophecy and tongues, and Paul is contrasting prophecy or preaching and tongues. And what I want to do at this point is just give you a scenario, I think, what was going on. I think the tongues in Corinthians are different. And I think it's not associated with the Spirit comes on them and they speak in tongues. No, he's saying it's better to prophesy or to preach than it is to pray to God in this tongue. Because you pray to God in this tongue and nobody understands you. Question, in Acts 2, the people did understand them in their original language. So what I'm suggesting is different. Now, here's what I would suggest is happening, okay? Let's suppose, okay, I'll take you from an example from my life, okay? I lived in Jerusalem for a year with my wife and some friends, Perry and Elaine Phillips. And as we went to church down this Baraka church down below Bethlehem, it was an Arab church. And so we learned to sing, for example, in Tahabibi and Tahayasti. And we learned to sing some of the songs, Jesus is my friend, in Arabic. Now, I wasn't fluent in Arabic, but I knew how to fake it, the Maha Shalama, Islami, and stuff like that. I knew how to say shukran and, the important things like thank you in Arabic and things. And we learned, it was an Arab church. Now, let's suppose then that I picked up some Arabic and I'm praying to God in Arabic, but Arabic is not my native tongue. And so I can fake certain things and I kind of understand what I'm saying. But let's suppose the prayer gets really intense. So I'm praying in Arabic, but question, when I'm praying in Arabic, do I have to think about every word that I'm saying? Because I'm not fluent in Arabic, and so I've got to double think everything, and I can't pray fluently, so I've got to think about it. What happens if all of a sudden I stop thinking about every word in Arabic and I just start praying to God? Is it very possible that I would switch from Arabic back into English and start praying to God in English? Yeah, because English is my native tongue. When I actually start thinking about praying to God, I would pray in English. Then I could be fluent and I could express myself. Whereas when I'm praying in Arabic, it's stilted and I've got to think about what I'm saying. So what I'm suggesting is that it's very likely that these guys were sailors from all over the world. There were people, Roman soldiers and others from all over the world. And what would happen is that they would pray, and they would pray and say Greek because everybody knew Greek and things. But as they got into their prayer and they really started praying to God, they would switch back to their native language. And therefore, when they switched back to their native language, nobody in the room understood what they were saying. And so Paul says, hey, don't. I'd rather say 5 words that are intelligible than 10,000 words that nobody understands. It's better to preach where everybody can understand what you're saying than to pray in a tongue. Because when you flip back to your native language and you start praying in your native language, yes, you're praying to God, all right, but nobody understands what you're doing, and therefore it doesn't edify, doesn't build up the church. So I think that's what's going on there at Corinth. Yes, it is a prayer language, but Paul's saying, no, prayer language doesn't benefit the people, and I think they're praying in their own native language. And when they switch back to that language, nobody understands it. And by the way, it's interesting here, there's 3 guidelines given, and I think I should read through these in chapter 14, verse 28, thereabouts in 1 Corinthians 14, 28. Let me just read this, 27, 28. It says this. These are guidelines given by Paul in the Scriptures. These are guidelines given by Paul in Scripture. He says, if you're going to speak in tongues this way, here are 3 guidelines that you should follow. Okay? And what I ask you is, and I've been in many, many situations where people have been speaking in tongues, my question is, do they follow these 3 guidelines? These are the 3 guidelines laid out by the Apostle Paul. Did they follow these guidelines? If anyone speaks in a tongue, 2 or at most 3 should speak. 2 or at most 3 should speak. I've been in groups where there's not 2 or 3, there's many, many, many people speaking in tongues. Paul says if a person speaks in tongues, 2 or at most 3 should speak. And then he says this, okay, so first, 2 or at most 3. You got a meeting, church is meeting, 2 or at most 3 should speak in tongues, okay, in this way, this kind of thing, okay? 1 at a time is second rule. 2 or at most 3, 1 at a time. How many times have I been in a service where basically you had several people, more than several actually, speaking in tongues all at the same time? Paul says no, 2 or at most 3, and they should be 1 at a time. And the third qualification is, Paul says, someone must interpret. Someone must interpret. In other words, the guy speaking in tongues, he's praying to God, nobody understands what he's saying, somebody has got to interpret that. And again, I've been in many groups where they're speaking in tongues and nobody interprets anything. Okay? Nobody interprets. And so those are 3 guidelines. And by the way, those 3 guidelines are from Scripture. Okay? 2 or at most 3, 1 at a time, and someone must interpret because for the edification of the church, following Paul's arguments there. So I think it's important to ask then, and so this is 1 Corinthians 14, and I think it's important. 1 at a time, 2 or at most 3, and then there must be an interpretation. Somebody, that explains it to the church, what you just said in prayer. Now, for me, this is a more abstract argument, but for me it's, I think, a powerful one. You got to ask God's use of language. Some of you have had me for Old Testament and New Testament, and one of the big principles for me, actually, in my life, and actually one of my callings in life, and actually what I'm doing right now with this digital video stuff, is that God always speaks the same language. God always speaks the same language. Now, if you've had me for Old Testament, you know that language is Hebrew, because Adam's name was Adam. Adam means man, or dust. Actually, his name was Dusty. But Adam's name, okay, was a Hebrew name. So if Adam's name was a Hebrew name, God named him, then Hebrew must be the language of heaven. And God speaks Hebrew. Well, God does speak Hebrew. The Old Testament, it says, "Thus saith the Lord, Kol Amar Yahweh." And so God speaks in Hebrew to the prophets in the Old Testament. So Hebrew is the language of God. But you know what the problem is? Was Adam's name really Adam? And as we explained in the Old Testament, no. Hebrew didn't exist back then. Hebrew is a dialect of the land of Canaan. The land of Canaan, Canaanite, it's a Canaanite dialect from the land of Canaan that was developed about 1800 BC. We know the development, Canaanite doesn't go all the way back. The older languages like Sumerian and others are much older. Canaanite developed about 1800 BC is when Canaanite was developed. That's Hebrew. Hebrew is a Canaanite dialect. Hebrew is just a dialect of Canaan. When Abraham migrated to the land of Canaan, he began to speak the Canaanite language, and that was the language that came down as Hebrew. Okay, so what I'm saying is, why did God speak Hebrew to Abraham and others? Okay, because it was their language, and God speaks the same language. Now what happens? When the Jews went to Babylon, they were carried away. The temple was destroyed in 586 BC. And Nebuchadnezzar came in and carried off, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Ezekiel, and all those guys, hauled Zedekiah, these people out, and took them to Babylon. They were in Babylon for 70 years or so. And what happened then? They picked up Aramaic. Aramaic was the language that was used at that time around 586, and they spoke Aramaic. So they switched from Hebrew to Aramaic. Now, the two languages are kind of like Spanish and Portuguese. They're sister languages, very close languages. But nevertheless, they switched to Aramaic. When they switched to Aramaic, what did God do? God switched to Aramaic, and so the book of Esther and various other things are written in Aramaic. And there's Aramaic sections of various books then that are later books that after the Babylonian exile. Then what happens? As we know from New Testament class, 333 BC. What happens in 333 BC? Alexander the Great comes forth and conquers the world and spreads a common language that he took and developed, and basically so his troops could all speak the same language, and wherever they went, they spread this language called Koine Greek, common Greek. It was shared. It wasn't the dialectical Greek of Attic, of Athens, and the various cities in Greece all had their own unique dialects. Alexander says, I can't have that, man. You're speaking one dialect, and versus another, you're in my army, everybody's got to speak the same language. And so basically, Greek was kind of like homogenized into one Koine called Common Greek. And Koine Greek went from about 300 BC to about 300 AD. So it's about 600-year period, Koine Greek, and then after 300 AD, it went into Byzantine Greek, and then now we've got modern Greek, which is quite different. Similar but different. God, what language was the New Testament written in? Well, you say God spoke Hebrew to Abraham and Aramaic to through Esther and things, and then now in the New Testament, the Jews switched to Greek language, and the church uses Greek, and guess what the New Testament's written in? Koine Greek. What language does God speak? He always speaks exactly the same language. He always speaks exactly the same language. He speaks the language of the people. Whatever language they speak, he speaks. God knows all things. He's omniscient. He's pretty fluent in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. By the way, I think he can also speak Latin. Did that for 1,000 years in the church and things. I think he can speak English, Chinese, Korean, Indian, various dialects in India and things like that. Spanish, Portuguese, he could speak those things. So God always speaks the language of the people. And I think that's a really important thing, that God speaks the language of the people. Whatever that language is, God speaks that language because he speaks to the ones he's addressing. So he doesn't speak this mysterious language that nobody understands. No, God speaks in a language that people understand. God is a revelatory God. He reveals himself. And when he reveals himself, he speaks in a language that the people can understand. Moses, when God said, Yehyeh v'Yehyeh, I am that I am, in Exodus 3:14, Moses said, oh, yeah, I understand what Yehyeh means, okay? It's from the verb haya, and he knows that, okay? So here's another thing, too. So my suggestion is that God, rather than flipping to languages that nobody understands in a group, no, God communicates in a language that the group understands. That's his pattern. That's been his pattern for 2,000 years in Scripture, okay? Now, linguistic analysis of tongues. There's a guy named Samron who did some linguistic analysis of tongues, and he basically taped tongue speaking for, I don't know, it was like 5 years, had various tapes of it and things like that. And what he discovered in this kind of linguistic analysis of the tongues, these linguists and things are, these linguists are the kind of people that can go into a tribal group, say in Indonesia. They can go into a tribal group and sit down and you know, the tribal person says booga booga and they say booga booga, and pretty soon they describe all the phonetics of it and describe the sounds, the various tonal and other types of things that a language may have. They describe it, the phonetics of it, and then they build morphemes, little things of meaning. And how do you make a plural? How do you make it singular? How do you say I? How do you say you? How do you say they? Do they even have an I, you, he, she, it system, first, second, and third person? Or do they use something different? And so linguists are trained with this so that they can decode almost any language on earth. I want to recommend very highly to you some of the people, Summer Institute of Linguistics, okay, SIL, Summer Institute of Linguistics, reflecting from the Wycliffe Bible translators. And the Wycliffe Bible translators are going all over the world trying to translate the Bible into all these tribal languages, every language on the face of the earth. And so they train their people in linguistics to go into a tribe where these people know nothing of the language, and they live with the people for a while, and then after a year, 2, 3, 4 years, 4, 5, 6, 7, 25, 30 years, they basically decode the language and actually write down the language. And many of these tribal groups have never had their language actually written ever. It's only been oral. And these Wycliffe Bible translators will go in and write it down and develop the scriptures and translate the scriptures into their languages. Okay? So it's kind of incredible. So these linguists are really good with languages, is what I'm trying to say. So they take the tongue speaking, and what Samron describes is, now tongue speaking isn't of the devil, and he says, moreover, it's a learned behavior. And what he associates it with, and let me just, and I'm doing this kind of in fun now, but do you guys do philosophy? In philosophy, you've got Nietzsche, okay, Friedrich Nietzsche. And so you've got Nietzsche, and Nietzsche says doing before being. Doing before being. Kant, Immanuel Kant, on the other hand, says being before doing. And Sinatra says doobie-doobie-doo. Okay? Now, what's the point of the doobie-doobie-doo? When Frank Sinatra sings a song and he goes doobie-doobie-doo, what does doobie-doobie-doo mean? Well, doobie-doobie-doo, can you hear the repetition of the D sound? You can hear the repetition of the sound. You can hear the cadence of it and things. Doobie-doobie-doo, what does that mean? And you say, well, it doesn't really mean anything. He's just bebopping around, okay? It's just like that. Actually, many of you do the same phenomena in what's called baby talk. How many of you have ever gone up to a baby and you scratch the baby's face and you go, oochie coochie coo, oochie coochie coo? Well, what does oochie coochie coo mean? What does oochie coochie coo? Now, by the way, can you hear the repetition of the oochie coochie coo, e sound in the repetition there, oochie coochie coo? And the baby says, hey man, don't touch me like that. I can't understand that. Is that what the baby says? Okay, the baby can't understand, so you go oochie coochie coo. The baby can't understand that either. So the baby says, speak to me in English, man. I don't do the oochie coochie coo stuff. Okay, just sorry, we're off. We had some babies over at our house last night. But what I'm saying is, you do oochie coochie coo. What does that mean? High repetition of consonantal sounds with the vowels on the end and things like that. You can describe it. Well, Samron says the same thing that oochie coochie coo, the tongue speaking that he had taped, is very similar to that, is oochie coochie coo. So it's a learned behavior, and a person can teach themselves it. And you can start off with a shambhala, shishbala, shishba, shamba, and you can go off on it and kind of get into the role of it and things, and people can do that, okay? Now, I'm not saying that to put anything down or anything, but this is a linguist's analysis of it. And he says it's just very similar to doobie-doobie-doo talk or oochie-coochie-goo talk and stuff.